Imagine discovering a forgotten archive and finding evidence that one ordinary object changed American society more quietly than almost any law ever did. Today, we're opening that file. A bicycle seems harmless today. It belongs in parks, on city streets, and in childhood memories. But in the 1890s, many Americans believed it threatened something far more valuable than public safety. Newspapers debated it. Ministers condemned it. Some physicians even warned that riding could permanently damage a woman's body. Looking back today, those fears seem almost unbelievable. Yet those reactions reveal something much larger than a debate about transportation. They reveal what Americans feared might happen when women gained the freedom to move without permission. Historians broadly agree that bicycles transformed women's mobility. What remains fascinating is how quickly a simple machine became a cultural symbol rather than merely a new invention. Before we go any further, look closely at these photographs. They are not simply showing bicycles. They are showing a society beginning to change, often without realizing it. Every cultural revolution begins quietly. Long before laws change, everyday habits begin to shift, and sometimes, history starts with nothing more dramatic than an ordinary morning ride. Contemporary newspapers recorded arguments. Personal diaries recorded excitement. Together, they tell two very different versions of the same America. Our story lives somewhere between them. So the real question is not why women rode bicycles. The real question is why millions of Americans cared so deeply that they did. And answering that question reveals far more about American culture than about bicycles themselves. To understand that story, we have to leave the bicycle behind for a moment and step into the everyday world American women were expected to live in before freedom ever arrived on two wheels. Before Americans argued about bicycles, they already agreed on something else: where a respectable woman belonged. Not on the open road, but close to home. For many middle-class women, daily life unfolded within a remarkably small world. Home, church, nearby shops, and family visits. Distance was measured not only in miles, but in expectations. Historians generally agree that these expectations were enforced more by custom than by written law. Respectability depended on being seen as careful, modest, and predictable. Newspapers rarely had to remind women how to behave. Society had already done that through generations of habit. The strongest rules are often the ones no one writes down. Yet beneath that quiet routine, America itself was changing. Railroads connected states. Factories expanded. Cities grew. The nation was moving faster than many of its traditions. Now imagine standing inside that world. Every road exists. Every destination exists. Yet almost none of them truly belong to you. That was the invisible boundary many women experienced every single day. This is why historians rarely describe the bicycle as merely a technological invention. Its greatest impact was psychological. It quietly expanded what people believed was possible. Primary sources show women writing about something surprisingly simple after learning to ride. They spoke less about speed and more about confidence. Confidence is difficult to measure in statistics. Yet it appears again and again in diaries, letters, interviews, and memoirs from the period. That repeated pattern is one reason historians take those personal accounts seriously. So before we examine the bicycle itself, we first have to understand the invisible limits it challenged. Because no invention changes history until it collides with culture. The bicycle did not invent women's desire for freedom. That desire had existed for generations. What the bicycle offered was something entirely different, a practical way to experience it. By the late 19th century, the United States was entering an age of extraordinary innovation. Electricity, telephones, railroads, and factories were reshaping everyday life. Yet for many women, daily routines remained surprisingly unchanged. Progress rarely arrives equally. While technology transformed the nation, social expectations often moved much more slowly. That gap between innovation and tradition would soon become impossible to ignore. Historians frequently describe this period as one of contradiction. America celebrated invention while simultaneously defending long-established social roles. Those two forces were on a collision course. One invention after another promised greater freedom of movement. But movement itself remained deeply unequal. The question was never simply who could travel. It was who was expected to stay. Take another look at this room behind me. Every document on these shelves tells the same story in a different way. The bicycle was never the beginning of change. It became the moment when hidden tensions finally became visible. When researchers examine newspapers from the 1890s, one pattern appears repeatedly. The loudest arguments were rarely about bicycles themselves. They were about what bicycles allowed women to do without supervision. That distinction matters, because history is often shaped less by technology than by the cultural meaning people attach to it. The bicycle became powerful because Americans made it symbolic. Most historians agree on one point. No single inventor intended to create a social revolution. Engineers designed a better bicycle. Society transformed it into something much larger. And that brings us to the question that puzzled Americans more than a century ago. If a bicycle was only a machine, why did it provoke fear, admiration, political debate, and even ridicule? To answer that, we have to meet the machine itself. At first glance, there was nothing revolutionary about the safety bicycle. It wasn't the fastest invention of its era. It wasn't the most expensive. And it certainly wasn't designed to challenge American culture. Engineers simply wanted to solve practical problems. Earlier bicycles were unstable, difficult to mount, and dangerous on uneven roads. The safety bicycle promised something remarkably ordinary: balance. Historians generally agree that lowering the frame and using two wheels of similar size made cycling accessible to far more people. Not only skilled young men, but ordinary women and older riders as well. That technical improvement seems almost insignificant today. Yet small engineering decisions often produce enormous cultural consequences. History is filled with inventions that quietly outgrew their original purpose. Contemporary advertisements rarely sold bicycles by promising freedom. They promoted comfort, stability, and reliability. Ironically, those practical features would become the foundation of a cultural revolution. This is one of my favorite advertisements from the period. Notice what it does not say. It never mentions equality. It never mentions politics. It simply sells a bicycle. Yet history would give that advertisement a much larger meaning than its creators ever imagined. Primary sources suggest that many women were attracted to cycling for practical reasons. Visiting relatives, running errands, or simply traveling farther in less time became easier than ever before. But practical freedom has a habit of becoming personal freedom. The farther women traveled, the more ordinary independence began to feel. And once independence becomes ordinary, society rarely returns to its previous expectations. No single ride changed America. No single woman transformed the culture overnight. Instead, thousands of quiet journeys accumulated into one of the most significant cultural shifts of the progressive era. And yet, as more women appeared on American roads, admiration was quickly joined by something else: concern, criticism, even fear. To understand why, we have to leave the bicycle shop and enter America's newspapers. The cultural battle over bicycles did not begin on the streets. It began in ink. Across America, newspapers became the arena where the meaning of women's cycling was fiercely debated. Some editors praised cycling as a symbol of modern progress. Others described it as a dangerous social trend. The bicycle itself never changed, but the stories surrounding it certainly did. Primary newspaper sources from the period reveal sharp disagreements rather than one unified opinion. America was not speaking with a single voice. It was arguing with itself. One of the most famous claims was that cycling might permanently damage a woman's health. Physicians and journalists debated posture, breathing, and even facial expression. Today, historians generally reject many of those medical warnings because they were unsupported by modern scientific evidence. They are now studied as examples of how cultural anxiety can influence medical opinion. This illustration became surprisingly influential. It appeared scientific, but historians now view it as reflecting the social fears of its time more than reliable medical research. It reminds us that authority and accuracy are not always the same thing. Not every physician agreed. Even in the 1890s, medical opinion was divided. That disagreement is important because history often remembers only the loudest voices, not the full conversation. Historians distinguish between documented medical publications and sensational newspaper reporting. Those sources sometimes overlapped, but they were never identical. Understanding that difference changes how we read history. Curiously, every warning seemed to make bicycles even more fascinating. Public criticism often produced greater curiosity. The more newspapers condemned cycling, the more Americans wanted to see it for themselves. But newspapers were only reacting to something much deeper. The real controversy was never about bicycles, medicine, or fashion. It was about independence. And nowhere was that conflict more visible than in the clothes women were expected to wear. Before the bicycle challenged American culture, clothing had already limited women's movement for generations. Long skirts, heavy petticoats, corsets, and fitted sleeves were designed for appearance, not for motion. Historians agree that fashion reflected social expectations. Clothing communicated class, respectability, and femininity. Changing what women wore was never simply about style. It questioned social identity itself. Riding a bicycle exposed an obvious problem. Dresses caught in chains. Long skirts tangled around pedals. Heavy fabric made balance difficult and sometimes dangerous. The bicycle didn't create this problem. It revealed it. Contemporary magazines began publishing practical advice for female cyclists. Some suggested shortening skirts. Others recommended entirely different garments. A conversation about transportation quietly became a conversation about fashion. Among the most discussed alternatives were bloomers. Loose trousers worn beneath shorter skirts. They had existed before bicycles, but cycling brought them into public view as never before. Notice something remarkable. No law required women to wear bloomers. No government promoted them. This was a cultural experiment unfolding in public, one everyday decision at a time. Reactions were immediate. Some Americans praised the outfit as practical. Others mocked it relentlessly. Satirical cartoons exaggerated its appearance, turning clothing into entertainment. And sometimes into ridicule. Historians distinguish carefully between satire and public opinion. Cartoons were designed to provoke laughter, not to measure what most Americans actually believed. They reveal anxieties, but not necessarily consensus. Yet ridicule often has an unexpected effect. When people continue doing something despite public criticism, that choice becomes more than practical. It becomes a statement about identity. And this is where our story becomes much bigger than bicycles or bloomers. Because once Americans began arguing about what women should wear, they soon found themselves debating something even more controversial. Who had the right to decide? Every society creates unwritten rules. In America, during the 1890s, one of those rules was simple. A respectable woman should never attract unnecessary attention. Yet a woman riding a bicycle almost always did. Contemporary newspapers frequently described female cyclists as conspicuous. That single word reveals more than it first appears. It wasn't the bicycle that stood out. It was the independence it represented. Historians generally agree that public visibility matters. The moment private behavior becomes visible in public spaces, it often becomes the subject of cultural debate. Bicycles moved women into spaces where they could no longer be ignored, and visibility changes perception. A woman confidently traveling alone challenged assumptions that had survived for generations. Not because she argued against them, but because she quietly demonstrated another possibility. Curiously, the bicycle required no speeches, no political campaign, and no public protest. Simply riding became a silent conversation between the rider and everyone watching. Imagine standing on this street in 1896. You don't hear applause, you don't hear shouting, you hear curiosity. Every passing bicycle quietly asks the same question. Must the old rules still apply? Primary sources suggest that many women never considered themselves revolutionaries. They simply wanted a practical, enjoyable way to travel. Yet history often transforms ordinary decisions into extraordinary symbols. This distinction is important. Historians caution against assuming every cyclist saw herself as part of a social movement. Individual motivations varied greatly, even while the broader cultural impact became undeniable. The evidence tells us what happened. It does not always tell us what every individual felt. Recognizing that difference is one of the most important principles of historical research. But if bicycles quietly changed how women moved through American streets, another question naturally follows. Did they also change how women saw themselves? The answer may be found not in newspapers, but in the words women wrote about their own lives. History often remembers speeches, elections, and famous leaders. But sometimes the most important evidence survives in far quieter places. In diaries written before bedtime, in letters sent to sisters, and in journals never meant for the public. Primary sources from the late 19th century reveal something remarkably consistent. Women rarely described cycling as an act of rebellion. Instead, they wrote about emotions that had been difficult to experience before: confidence, independence, and possibility. Those words matter because they come from the people living through the change itself. Historians value personal documents not because they represent everyone, but because they preserve experiences that statistics never can. One recurring theme appears again and again: riding alone. For many women, it was the first time they could choose their own destination without depending on a carriage, a family member, or a fixed schedule. That does not mean every woman experienced the same freedom. Rural communities, cities, wealth, occupation, and family expectations all shaped individual lives differently. Historians caution against treating one experience as universal. This is one of the reasons historians spend years studying personal archives. Government records tell us what happened. Personal diaries help explain what those changes actually felt like. Together, they complete the picture. Interestingly, many diary entries never even mention politics. They describe fresh air, longer journeys, laughter with friends, and the quiet satisfaction of arriving somewhere alone. Freedom often enters history disguised as ordinary happiness. Modern historians often emphasize this distinction. Political movements certainly mattered. But cultural change also happens through everyday routines repeated thousands of times until they begin to feel normal. Curiously, the more ordinary cycling became, the less extraordinary it appeared. And that may be the greatest sign that culture had already begun to change. Revolutions rarely announce the moment they become everyday life. But if bicycles quietly reshaped everyday life, another institution was watching these changes with increasing concern. Not newspapers this time, but religious leaders, educators, and defenders of traditional morality. Their response would become one of the most revealing chapters in this story. By the late 1890s, the bicycle had become far more than a machine. It had become a question. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all was this: if women could travel independently, what else might they choose for themselves? Across the country, ministers, educators, and community leaders began discussing cycling from a moral perspective. Their concerns were rarely about metal, wheels, or engineering. They were about changing social behavior. Historians distinguish carefully between official church positions and individual sermons. While some religious leaders criticized women's cycling, others remained silent, or even welcomed social progress. America was never culturally uniform. The strongest objections often focused on independence itself. A woman traveling alone meant she was making decisions without immediate supervision. For some Americans, that possibility seemed deeply unsettling. Yet there is remarkably little evidence that bicycles created widespread social disorder. Modern historians generally conclude that many contemporary fears reflected cultural anxiety more than documented reality. This is one of the most important lessons in historical research. Fear itself becomes part of history. Even when predictions prove wrong, they reveal what a society values and what it worries about losing. Similar moments have appeared throughout American history. Again and again, new technologies have been blamed for changing family life, morality, or youth culture. The bicycle was one of the earliest examples of this familiar pattern. What makes the bicycle unique is that it placed this debate in plain view. Every ride happened on public streets. Every journey became visible. Every observer interpreted the same image through different cultural beliefs. Historians often remind us that public opinion cannot be reduced to a single headline. Newspapers amplified conflict because conflict sold papers. Everyday life, however, was usually quieter than the headlines suggested. And while newspapers debated morality and society, argued over tradition, another movement was quietly gathering strength. Women themselves were beginning to organize. Not simply around bicycles, but around something much larger: equal citizenship. The next chapter begins there. By the end of the 19th century, two movements were becoming increasingly visible across America. One demanded the right to vote. The other quietly demonstrated the right to move. Although they were not identical movements, history would eventually connect them. Historians caution against oversimplifying this relationship. Bicycles did not create the women's suffrage movement. That movement had begun decades earlier. But cycling expanded everyday independence in ways that complemented broader demands for equality. Few public figures expressed that connection more clearly than Susan B. Anthony, who famously praised the bicycle for what it had done for women. Her statement remains one of the most frequently quoted observations from the era. Anthony argued that bicycles had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. Historians often cite this remark, not as statistical proof, but as powerful evidence of how influential cycling had become in the public imagination. That distinction matters. One quotation cannot explain an entire cultural transformation. But when personal testimony aligns with newspapers, diaries, photographs, and social trends, historians begin to see a convincing pattern emerge. Whenever I examine these sources together, I'm reminded that history rarely changes because of one dramatic event. More often, it changes because thousands of ordinary people quietly begin living differently before the law ever catches up. Across American cities, cycling clubs continued to grow. Weekend rides became social gatherings where women could build friendships, exchange ideas, and experience public life with greater confidence than previous generations. Not every participant joined for political reasons. Most simply enjoyed riding. Yet cultural change often happens precisely this way. Ordinary recreation slowly reshapes what society considers normal. Looking back today, it becomes surprisingly difficult to separate transportation from identity. The bicycle carried people across roads. But it also carried new expectations across generations. But one question still remains unanswered. If bicycles became so widely accepted, why do so few Americans today remember the extraordinary controversy they once created? The answer lies in one of history's greatest paradoxes. Here's the strange part of this story. Today, millions of Americans ride bicycles without giving them a second thought. Yet 130 years ago, that same machine sparked debates about medicine, morality, fashion, religion, and the future of the American family. Historians call this phenomenon cultural normalization. Once an idea becomes ordinary, people often forget it was ever controversial. Success quietly erases the memory of resistance. The bicycle did not disappear from American life. Quite the opposite. It became so familiar that its revolutionary past faded into the background. The object remained. The memory slowly vanished. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Technologies that once frightened society eventually become invisible parts of everyday life. We stop noticing them precisely because they succeeded. The greatest cultural revolutions often leave surprisingly few monuments. Instead, they survive as habits. Riding to work, visiting friends, exploring the countryside. Everyday freedom quietly replaces yesterday's controversy. When people visit this archive, many ask me the same question. Where is the moment that changed everything? They're often surprised when I answer, there wasn't one. History rarely moves in a single dramatic leap. More often, it changes one ordinary day at a time. Primary sources support that conclusion. No newspaper announced that women had suddenly become free. No diary records a single day when society transformed overnight. Change accumulated gradually, almost invisibly. That gradual transformation is exactly why historians value ordinary documents so highly. They capture change while it is still unfolding, before anyone realizes they are living through history. Looking backward makes history appear inevitable. Living through it never feels that way. The women riding those bicycles had no way of knowing they would become symbols in future history books. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this archive. Revolutions don't always announce themselves. Sometimes, they simply ride quietly past while everyone is looking somewhere else. Let's return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How could one ordinary bicycle become powerful enough to change American culture? After examining the evidence, the answer is no longer about the machine itself. Historians generally agree that technology alone never transforms society. People do. The bicycle simply arrived at the exact moment when millions of Americans were already beginning to rethink tradition, identity, and opportunity. Every source we explored tells a different part of the story. Newspapers reveal public debate. Diaries reveal private emotions. Advertisements reveal commercial ambition. Photographs preserve moments that no one expected would become history. Together, these sources tell us something remarkably simple. Americans did not merely learn to ride bicycles. They learned to imagine new possibilities for everyday life. Perhaps that explains why the bicycle still feels ordinary today. Cultural victories often disappear into daily life. Once freedom becomes routine, people stop remembering the struggle that made it possible. As historians, our job is not to celebrate every invention. It is to understand why some inventions quietly reshape the way people see themselves. And few objects accomplish that more effectively than the bicycle. Modern America still carries traces of this transformation. Not because every woman rides a bicycle, but because independence has become an ordinary expectation rather than an extraordinary privilege. That is why cultural historians continue studying stories like this. They remind us that history is often hidden inside the ordinary objects we stop noticing. The bicycle is no longer controversial. The arguments have faded. The headlines have disappeared. But the freedom it helped normalize continues to travel through American life every single day. Sometimes history is not waiting inside famous speeches or dramatic battles. Sometimes it is waiting inside an old photograph, quietly reminding us that extraordinary change often begins with an ordinary decision. The influence of the bicycle did not stop at America's borders. During the closing years of the 19th century, similar conversations about women, mobility, and independence were unfolding across Europe and beyond. Yet America's story remained uniquely shaped by its own culture of individual freedom. Historians caution against assuming every country experienced cycling in the same way. Cultural traditions, religion, industrial development, and political systems all shaped very different outcomes. What made America distinctive was its long-standing belief that personal freedom formed part of national identity. The bicycle unexpectedly became one more way ordinary citizens expressed that ideal. Interestingly, many bicycle advertisements never used political language. Instead, they sold adventure, health, confidence, and modern living. Those commercial messages quietly echoed cultural values Americans already admired. Advertising does not simply sell products. It also reflects aspirations. When companies discovered that independence itself could be marketed, they revealed what many Americans were already beginning to desire. Whenever I compare these advertisements with private diaries, I notice something fascinating. Businesses sold freedom as an idea. Ordinary women described freedom as a feeling. Those two perspectives rarely use the same words, but they point toward the same cultural transformation. This is one reason historians combine many different types of evidence. No single document tells the whole story. Understanding culture requires comparing voices that often disagreed with one another. Looking across these sources, one pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The bicycle repeatedly appears wherever Americans discussed opportunity, progress, education, recreation, or women's independence. That pattern does not prove bicycles caused every social change. Historians avoid such simple conclusions. But it strongly suggests that bicycles became one of the most recognizable symbols of a rapidly changing America. And yet, even after everything we've discovered, one mystery still remains. If bicycles became symbols of freedom, why did Americans eventually stop talking about them altogether? The answer begins with something historians call cultural invisibility. One of the most fascinating ideas in cultural history is something scholars often describe as normalization. It happens when a revolutionary idea becomes so ordinary that people forget it was ever revolutionary at all. By the early 20th century, newspapers no longer devoted countless editorials to women riding bicycles. The controversy had not been won through a single argument. It had simply faded as everyday life changed. Historians often point out that silence can be just as meaningful as headlines. When public debate disappears, it sometimes signals that society has quietly accepted what it once resisted. This pattern extends far beyond bicycles. Throughout American history, many ideas that once provoked fear eventually became so common that later generations assumed they had always existed. That is why historians study ordinary objects so carefully. Everyday artifacts often preserve the hidden story of cultural transformation more effectively than monuments or political speeches ever could. When visitors walk through archives like this, many stop in front of famous documents. But I often find myself drawn to the ordinary things. A worn bicycle saddle, a faded family photograph, or a diary with no famous author's name. Sometimes those quiet objects tell the deepest stories. Primary sources rarely announce their importance. Historians must compare thousands of small details before larger patterns begin to emerge. That patient process is what transforms evidence into historical understanding. The bicycle reminds us that cultural history is not only about governments, wars, or elections. It is also about ordinary families making ordinary choices that gradually reshape a nation. Looking backward, we can clearly see the transformation. Those living through it could not. They simply adapted to a world that felt slightly different each passing year. History often moves at exactly that speed. So perhaps the greatest achievement of the bicycle was never that it changed American society. It was that it changed society so successfully that future generations no longer noticed the change at all. But our story isn't finished yet, because one final question remains. What does all of this reveal about America itself? We've spent nearly 20 minutes talking about a bicycle. But if you've been paying close attention, you may have realized this story was never truly about transportation. It was always about America itself. Throughout American history, ordinary objects have repeatedly become symbols of extraordinary ideas. The frontier cabin represented self-reliance. The railroad represented expansion. The automobile represented independence. For one remarkable generation, the bicycle represented possibility. Historians often describe American culture as a constant negotiation between tradition and innovation. Rarely does one side completely defeat the other. Instead, each generation quietly redraws the boundary between them. That tension appears everywhere in this story. Newspapers defended tradition. Inventors celebrated progress. Families adapted at their own pace. Together, they shaped the America that would enter the 20th century. Perhaps that explains why no single person deserves credit for this cultural transformation. It was built by inventors, teachers, factory workers, mothers, students, journalists, merchants, and countless women whose names never appeared in history books. When people ask me what history really is, I usually answer with another question. Whose story are we choosing to remember? Archives are full of famous names, but they're equally full of ordinary people whose quiet decisions shaped the nation just as profoundly. This is why cultural historians spend so much time studying everyday life. Elections explain who governed America. Daily habits explain how Americans actually lived. Both stories are essential, but only together do they reveal the whole picture. The bicycle reminds us that freedom is rarely introduced all at once. It usually arrives through small choices repeated by ordinary people until those choices become impossible to reverse. Looking back, the most remarkable achievement was not that women learned to ride. It was that later generations found it difficult to imagine a time when they couldn't. That is how successful cultural change often looks. And with that, we've reached the final archive in today's collection. But before we close this file, there's one last photograph I'd like to show you, because it quietly brings this entire story full circle. At the beginning of this documentary, I asked you to imagine opening a forgotten archive. Now, after examining hundreds of photographs, newspapers, diaries, and letters, we can finally understand why that forgotten file still matters today. None of these women expected to become historical symbols. They simply lived their lives, solved practical problems, and embraced new opportunities as they appeared. History remembered them for reasons they never could have imagined. That may be the most humbling lesson every archive teaches. The people who quietly shape history almost never realize they are doing it. Only future generations recognize the significance hidden inside ordinary moments. Modern historians continue discovering new details because thousands of personal collections remain preserved in museums, universities, libraries, and family archives across the United States. Every newly cataloged document has the potential to deepen our understanding. This is why history is never truly finished. Every generation asks different questions, and those new questions often reveal new meanings hidden inside familiar evidence. As researchers, we don't search for perfect heroes or perfect stories. We search for understanding. And sometimes understanding begins with nothing more than an old photograph that everyone else walked past without noticing. Looking through these archives reminds us that freedom rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly through thousands of ordinary choices, repeated until society eventually accepts what once seemed impossible. That pattern extends far beyond bicycles. It appears whenever Americans redefine work, education, technology, family life, or personal identity. Cultural history is ultimately the history of ordinary people adapting to extraordinary change. If we only remember presidents and wars, we miss half the American story. The other half belongs to teachers, mechanics, mothers, students, shopkeepers, immigrants, and dreamers whose daily decisions quietly transformed the nation. And that is why this bicycle still deserves its place inside the archive. Not because it is rare, but because it reminds us that the smallest objects sometimes carry the biggest stories. Before we close this archive, there's one final misconception worth correcting. Many people assume history changes because one invention suddenly transforms society. The evidence tells a more complicated story. Historians generally agree that inventions rarely create cultural change by themselves. Instead, they succeed when society is already beginning to change from within. The bicycle arrived at exactly such a moment in American history. That explains why the same bicycle produced very different reactions. Some Americans saw opportunity. Others saw danger. Most simply saw another machine. The object never changed, but the meaning people attached to it certainly did. Cultural historians call this symbolic transformation. An ordinary object becomes extraordinary because it begins representing ideas far larger than itself. In this case, the bicycle came to symbolize mobility, confidence, and personal choice. Yet the bicycle never belonged to only one movement. It was embraced by workers, teachers, doctors, students, merchants, and families. That diversity is precisely why its influence spread so quickly across American society. Whenever I finish researching a story like this, I remind myself of one simple principle. Objects don't make history. People do. The bicycle mattered because millions of ordinary Americans chose to give it meaning through the way they lived their lives. Looking back, perhaps the bicycle's greatest achievement was not that it carried people farther. It carried American culture across an invisible boundary. From expectation toward possibility. That invisible boundary appears again throughout American history. Each generation inherits traditions, questions them, and quietly redraws them. Sometimes the changes are dramatic. More often, they unfold almost unnoticed. If there is one lesson hidden inside this archive, it is this. Cultural change is usually recognized only after it has already happened. Those living through it rarely know they are participating in history. So before we leave this library, I'd like to return to the very first photograph we examined together. Because once you've seen the entire story, that ordinary photograph no longer looks ordinary at all. At the beginning of our journey, I asked you to look at a single bicycle. Now, after following the evidence through archives, newspapers, diaries, advertisements, and photographs, that bicycle no longer looks like an ordinary object. It has become a witness. Not to one dramatic event, but to thousands of quiet decisions that gradually reshaped American culture. Those decisions were rarely announced. They were simply lived. Historians often remind us that cultural change leaves fingerprints rather than headlines. Those fingerprints appear in ordinary photographs, family albums, shopping catalogs, and handwritten letters preserved by people who never imagined future generations would read them. Perhaps the greatest irony is this. The more successful the bicycle became, the less people talked about it. Victory transformed controversy into normal life, and normal life rarely makes history books. That quiet disappearance is not failure. It is the final stage of cultural acceptance. When an idea becomes invisible, it often means it has become part of everyday identity. Every archive eventually teaches the same lesson. History is not only preserved in famous speeches or government documents, it also survives inside ordinary objects patiently waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Looking back today, it becomes difficult to imagine America without women freely traveling, working, studying, and exploring their communities. Yet every ordinary freedom has an extraordinary history hidden behind it. And perhaps that is why cultural history matters. It reminds us that societies rarely change through one revolutionary moment. They change because millions of ordinary people quietly choose a different tomorrow. Every diary we opened, every newspaper we examined, every faded photograph we restored, has pointed toward the same conclusion. Freedom often begins long before anyone realizes history is being written. So let's return this photograph to its place. Not because the story is over, but because every archive still contains countless forgotten stories waiting to be rediscovered. Before we close this archive for today, take one last look at this bicycle. Not as a machine, but as evidence. Evidence that even the most ordinary object can quietly reshape the course of a nation. Historians rarely search for the loudest story. More often, they search for the overlooked one. The story hidden beneath everyday life, waiting patiently for someone to ask a better question. The bicycle reminds us that America's history is not only the story of presidents, wars, or economic booms. It is also the story of ordinary people quietly expanding the meaning of freedom, one generation at a time. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside this archive. Freedom often arrives so gradually that people hardly notice it while they are living through it. Only history allows us to see the pattern. Every photograph we've explored today once belonged to someone's ordinary life. Every newspaper headline reflected a real debate. Every diary entry captured a genuine emotion. Together, they transformed scattered memories into the larger story we now call history. The next time you see an old bicycle in a museum, or perhaps leaning quietly in a forgotten barn, you may remember that it once carried far more than a rider. It carried the possibility of a different future. If you enjoy exploring the hidden cultural stories behind ordinary objects, forgotten traditions, and everyday American life, I'd be honored to have you join me again. There are thousands of untold stories still waiting inside these archives, and we'll open them together, one file at a time. Until our next journey through history, thank you for spending time inside the American Time Capsule.